Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle, and I'm with No Violence for Kids Canada. We are excited to start another dialogue with you today on unpacking all things Section 43. And just before we get started, I want to take note that I'm here in my home in Surrey, British Columbia, which is on the Tawasin Nation Treaty Territory, home of the Semiahmoo people and the Kekwa people. I recognize that when I look outside, all I see is concrete. And I know that's not what this land is meant to do. So it's up to me and up to everyone to make sure that we do look outside, put our feet on the soil, find the trees, get in nature, and think about the gift that we have to live in Canada, and also all of the protectors of this land that have been here from time immemorial before us. So I'm grateful to be here today. And also, I'm grateful for everyone that's coming together to have conversations to reduce violence for kids, and especially to take responsibility on the truth and reconciliation reports, and especially the 94 calls to action. Today, we're going to be talking to Michelle Robinson, and I encourage everyone to tune in, make comments, share, and like our page, because this is a conversation that we all need to sit down and pay attention to, because reconciliation means coming together. I won't lie, I'm a little nervous about our conversation today because I'm learning, and I probably will be learning for a very long time till the day I die on how to do this work. It's where my passion is, and it's really where I believe when this comes together that we're really going to do better at keeping kids safe, all kids safe, and especially give justice to all of the crime scenes that are being found all over Canada, North America, and the world. So it's time that we come together and look honestly what happened, what's happening, and what can we do about it. And No Violence for Kids Canada is about raising public awareness for Section 43, which is a law in our Criminal Code of Canada that was written in 1892. It's an archaic colonial law that gives reasonable force for parents to use violent discipline with their children. This needs to stop. This is a sanction in our criminal code that gave reasonable force to priests, nuns, and all of the folks that harmed kids in our past. This needs to change. It's time to repeal Section 43, and we encourage everyone to start this conversation. Mail your MP, have comment, like, and share our posts. Do anything that you can to be active. And just a final note before we move to Michelle is that April 30th is International End Corporal Punishment Day. So please remember that this is still alive and well in Canada and legal. And until we have public pressure on our government at all levels, children are still facing violent discipline. So that's my opening spiel today. I can't wait to get started and talk to Michelle. So Michelle is here. She is an incredibly talented podcaster. She is a mom and living in Calgary. So her podcast is Native Calgarian. She has also run for Liberal Party in Calgary, which is super brave. I'd love to do a whole podcast on that courage and that experience. And just last week, I'm very grateful to attend her podcast with Valerie Michelson, where we talked about Section 43 and had a really great dialogue on the calls to action as well. So welcome, Michelle.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for that introduction. Oki Nagana go Meko Che Stokom Aki. That was me in Blackfoot trying to say Red Thunderwoman. That's my name. But I do go by Michelle. I use she and her pronouns. And I think it's important to always acknowledge our pronouns to attempt to make the world a better place for those who identify as trans. As a cis straight person, nothing makes me more sad than how our people are treated as Indigenous people, but also the LGBTQ2 plus community. So I think that's really important to always say our pronouns. I want to acknowledge where I'm situated. I'm on Blackfoot territory. The Blackfoot Confederacy actually extends into the U.S. It's the Blackfoot Nation or Blackfeet Nation in the south, and Piikani, Siksika, and Gunai here in Canada. And then Treaty 7 was signed here in 1877, and that included the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, Bears Paw Nations of the Stoney Nation, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I always acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. And my lineage is I'm actually Sahtu Dene, so my family is from not just Yellowknife, but even further north, and we're the Great Bear Lake tribe. That's where our lineage comes from, and I'm quite honored to be the great granddaughter of Milo. For folks who are up there, they would know who he is. My family is from Yellowknife, so I'm by the Canadian government standards, Yellowknife Dene, according to their Indian Act imposed status card. And my family survived Indian residential school. My mother's a survivor of domestic violence, so I'm really honored to be here. And I know me being here is thanks to their legacy of survival. So I'm honored to be here to talk to you about all of these things and more.
What an incredible land acknowledgement that you make. I'm taking notes because it's part of my learning, but I'm so grateful you're here. And also how fascinating to learn all the way up past Yellowknife. And I want to now know about your great granddad. So you just opened a ton of questions, Michelle. I'm so grateful you're here too. And I always open with the first question. Growing up here, one of the things that was familiar to me was Fred Rogers. And watching Mr. Rogers on TV was a big deal. And I, I thought that was interesting, but it wasn't until after he died really that I went back and looked at like what his writing and advocacy was about. And there was a quote that really hit me, and it's anyone who helps a child in their life is a hero of mine. So, that was a big deal when I heard that, because that's really me. Like I fangirl over researchers and advocates and
me too. That's where you should be. Not celebrities that are problematic,
Right? Like literally on the front line of a lecture on the front row, just like, oh my goodness, like this is fun. So it's awful. But at the same time, I actually feel this liberation in that, right? So it's not that I look up, to influencers on Instagram. I'm looking up to scholars who have published papers on violence or are published papers or written books on collaborative problem solving or mediation. These are the things that really get me excited. Or, different rules for radicals is a book I'm reading now. And that's like, wow, this is like a real traditional book on like breaking down power struggles and all of that sort of thing. So Michelle, you're a hero. I see you in this light. And so a little bit fangirly in the way that I just go through your podcast and I go, wow, the courage and the conversations that you're having all intersectionally in some way or another are about kids. In some way or another, it comes back down to kids. So tell me what seeded your passion? I know your history a little bit, but tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So obviously if my mom survived it, I remember my first memories of life are domestic violence. And, I'm 45, so it's been my adult life unpacking what that looks like. So 25 years of understanding childhood trauma. And then for myself, being afraid to have children because I didn't want to be inflicting childhood trauma onto yet another generation. But I had felt in my 20s that I'd went through enough counseling that we did brave it and did have a child. And at the age of 30. So, we wanted to have more kids, but actually even that experience was horrific because in Canada, it is quite normal for the hospital staff, once they see that you're a status native, to call child services and to do unnecessary tests and mistreat you. It's just racism in our healthcare in general. So as a person, sorry,
there was a term birth that is like a racist term where Indigenous moms, I spoke with one where she was almost having a baby and she was afraid to have the baby because she was worried about the baby being taken right at birth and the stress on her. Sorry to interrupt you, but that experience just came up and it.
Yeah, it's called birth alerts.
That's and, right.
Yeah, I know that's what you were searching for, and that happened to me. And I didn't think it would happen to me. I had the confidence of a mediocre white woman in my mind, and that I thought that wouldn't apply to me. And I think that's really important to say because, one of the questions you kind of pre-screened me with was, what did I hear when I was growing up? And I was told by my very racist white family that that natives were awful people, blah 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 blah, but I wasn't one of those. I wasn't that.
Okay.
So I had, been brainwashed my entire life to believe racism is something you look for. Racism is
Mhm.
something that, other people experience, but I won't experience. And obviously, I felt it full force in the most vulnerable position of my life, giving birth. And after that moment, it changed me. And
Mm.
yeah, that's where my political activism began.
Okay.
Yeah, I had spoke to my MLA, and
Mhm.
at the time, Hung Pham was being investigated. Now he's wanted criminally. So
Mm.
his successor, Manmeet Bhullar, the late Manmeet Bhullar, came to my door, and he was open to what I was talking about. Because
Wow.
when I speak to people, I talk about solutions. I try not to focus on what happened to me.
Mhm.
I was talking about funding midwifery in Alberta because at that time in 2007 it wasn't funded. And
Right.
that was the barrier my husband had about
Mhm.
me having. He said, "Well, it's free for us to have hospital births, so why wouldn't we do that?" And I couldn't
Mm.
really argue that logic. So we had hired a doula out of pocket, and I believe to this day, if it wasn't for her, I probably would have had a lot more problems when I did give birth. Anyway, we did get midwifery funded as of May 5th, 2008. So
Mhm.
every child born in Alberta from a midwife in 2008 is because of the late Mahmoud Boular's work for conservative. He was one of the only ones I really respect. So I have a deep appreciation for him. Yep.
That must have taken a ton of organizing, Michelle. I'd love to hear about the journey because getting legislation and regulations changed is no easy task. So thank
Well,
you so much for sharing your
sure.
experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, devastating and scary.
It was awful. It was, and we wanted to have more children, but after that experience, I was so traumatized that I had to go through counseling again. And
God,
I used terminology like birth rape because that's what it
yeah.
felt like. You know,
Oh my gosh.
it was
Yeah.
awful. Yeah, and I learned a lot more about the health
Hmm.
community and how unaccountable it is, and how
Hmm.
and ironically, I'm going through that yet again, but in a different way with
Hmm.
being denied Narcan. So
Right.
there's just all these
Yeah.
issues that constantly happen, and I mean, I'm here talking about them as opposed to a lot of folks who didn't survive. That's why we as Indigenous people talk about ongoing genocide because that's what it is. It's ongoing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I hear you there. And
Yeah.
thank you for mentioning that ongoing genocide. I think that's a really important piece to recognize. And another hard word, right? There's, you and I in our dialogue together, we keep, I think, pinpointing these difficult words that are, need to break through into everyday mainstream conversations, but can also cause some controversy and some division, and people are dropping family and friends over them. Like, so ongoing genocide is one. I want to know, like, so hearing about, how did you hear about white people growing up? From what I'm hearing you say, being, you heard that it wasn't going to be something with you because you had whiteness or something. Help me
Yeah.
understand that.
Sure. So my dad is white. My dad's so white. I'm a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution. So, as it was the time in the early 80s, racism in the legal
Mhm.
system, which is still rampant today, just gave custody to the father. And that's what happened with my family when they divorced. He got full custody of me and my brother. And, it wasn't an easy journey for him, but it wasn't an
Mhm.
easy journey for me either. And then unpacking, racism and sexism and domestic violence and childhood trauma, like that's been a really long journey for me as well. So, anyway, his parents were white and very much hated natives. And I shouldn't say it in that way. The terminology they used indicated they
Mm.
hated natives, but
That's
they always
mhm.
made the exception for me and my brother. We were the exception, and
Right.
disappointing because now that they've passed, it wasn't a conversation we could ever really have. And um, as they aged, my grandfather, he was a former military man. He
Mm,
really believed that in white supremacy, that he was better than black people, he was better than
mhm.
natives, he was better than Ukrainians. And it's like, when you start unpacking how bad racism actually is, it's just disappointing. And here in Alberta, there's still, different
Right.
categories of white people, including
Mhm.
Ukrainian. So, like, a lot of people say that's why Ed Stelmach wasn't as successful as a premier, because ultimately he was still Ukrainian, and the racism within the Conservatives is so deep seated that
Mhm.
someone like him can't succeed, let alone a woman like Alison Redford, right?
Exactly. So, I just want to touch back on what you said, the phrases that you heard. Do you remember as a child? Because I'm not sure your age, but I'm going to assume you and I are around the same generation. So I'm
Yeah,
40,
sure.
73. So it'd be cool to hear what you were hearing and what I was hearing.
Well, obviously, the number one thing I hear, even to this day, is natives do it to themselves. I've broken relationships over family over this
Hmm.
this phrase because their lack of wanting to understand the gravity of what they're saying by when they say
Yes.
that, and it denies systemic racism when with a statement like that. And another thing, playing the race card. So I need to remind your viewers that when you're born in Canada as an Indigenous person, right away we are, imposed an Indian. It's the wrong terminology even, but
Hmm.
Canada's constitution foundation is based off of the Indian Act. So
Hmm.
that, it has to be understood and acknowledged that that is, a racist law, and that this entire country was built on racism and white supremacy. So,
Absolutely. What an incredible summary that
mm,
was. It was like so good. I mean, I've got stacks of books to understand more about the Indian Act, colonization, our history, and thank you. So yeah, it's the Indians' fault. So I heard that one quite a lot growing up. So my father also Roman Catholic, white, French, affluent kind of family, sent him to all boys school that were run by the Brotherhood of Priests. So the outcome of that fell on my shoulders with the abuse of that. Unfortunately, he died of an over. Pretty much, we're pretty sure like an overdose about 3 years ago after living a lifetime on the street. So, as a white dude, right? Who was very racist growing up. I often wonder if he was alive today. I think his biggest alignment would be, with Indigenous folks because he was definitely had the pain there too. But he was part of the genocide. He was part of the messaging. Early on in my life, I heard one of the big ones that was really scary for me was it's hard for me to say this out loud, but I need to because we need to be honest. And I work in parenting. I'm going to sell you to the Indians.
yeah,
That
yeah,
that was a big one that was told to me when I was, I don't know, misbehaving, and it wasn't that bad of a kid, but I did hear that.
sure, sure. Which is ironic because it was always reversed. We were always sold to the white people.
Where's this common ground with all these bad children? That's where I need to go, Michelle.
Yep. It's pretty, yeah, it's so ironic. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not funny, but I think humor is
No.
the only way you can kind of deal with the ridiculousness and the harm that was
Oh,
perpetuated by all of this. So, for
right.
folks wondering why we're laughing, it's that
Yeah.
mechanism of dealing with the ridiculousness of it.
It's actually sickening that phrase is waking me up at night. So I don't find it funny when I'm sitting alone reading and learning. I find
Mm,
it like viscerally, I want to vomit because the vision that was given to me was they were going to tie me, the Indians were going to tie me to a tree and light fires around me with feathers in the hair and do some dance around and viciously attack me. So there was that savage um, um, insinuation there,
yeah,
and which is super, to think about that was just a joke. It was never done because, it wasn't as a big punishment. It was more like, you better eat all your vegetables or we'll sell you to the Indians, right? It was so commonplace.
yes,
That is what makes me ill. That's
yeah,
the part where I go, oh my gosh, like, And ironically, in my first year at college many years ago, my bestest friend was from the Tackle Lake Nation band up, like most of interior, right? A massive area up there. And her mom and her moved down to the city when she was young. And so it was, some bumpy roads there. Because another term I'm just going to say, which is going to be probably the most difficult of this conversation, was I didn't know any better, but I called her a squaw.
Yeah, because it was commonplace. And
Yeah.
frankly, so I'm going to you a quick story from up north. I have a fellow that I talked to, and he actually had on his truck something about, no squaws allowed or something. And you know what? I hate to say it, but this is in the Grand Prairie region. A lot of people still use that terminology. And that's
Wow.
why when people pretend like that word doesn't exist anymore, I'm like, I can tell you, I was walking to work in 2022, and right across from Mawada Armory, somebody wrote it in a black marker. So, and I have the pictures to prove it. I put it on Twitter. People were like, it's just another. And it's like, yeah, and yesterday our police chief legitimately tried to say to a black counselor, oh, white lives matter is an awful sticker, but, it's not a hate crime. So at the end of the day, our laws, our, public servants that are supposed to protect us, no concept of the harm
No.
that these terms are perpetuating. And it's just so commonplace in
Yes.
2022. And it's wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
nobody is making a law. And I mean, we're still talking about not hitting children, but it's embedded in our criminal code that it's okay to hit children. So it's really hard to fight for what's right when our own politicians, our own leaders, our own public, what do you do? They just don't care. And so how
Mm-hmm.
do I raise my daughter? In this world, knowing the type of barriers I'm facing.
So true. And coming back to that, I study systemic barriers toward effective parenting, and I see, colonization at the top of the list, and it keeps rising. The more I learn, the more I recognize it's absolutely gets in the way of family life and parenting. Well, not just in the obvious ways, but in the intricate ways in the language around us every day right now. And I say that language is the ignition of cognition. So by using terms that, people have spoken up that matter to them. It can be anything in our family homes, in our community, but especially when it's issues of social justice, right? The folks that have really called on these terms have had to have, tons of lived experience and courage. And we have a lot of learning to do about terms. Um, White supremacy, racism, genocide, murdered and missing women for some reason gets people worked up, right? Um, I mean, you could probably go on, but those are the top. Is there any other phrases? Let's put them out there right now, Michelle. What else phrases come up?
Well, and I think the biggest thing is I'm in Alberta, and it's predominantly Christian. Anything that's against the church in any
Oh,
capacity.
right. Yeah.
I mean, you have flocks of people, that will trip over themselves to
Yeah.
try to justify the violence that spiritual abuse that is perpetuated by churches. It's constant.
It is constant, and it's interesting because I get that now kind of the opposite when it comes to like when people say bless you or God bless you, I just get cringe, right? So I'm just like, please don't. Like, and so people do, I guess it's hard for them to understand that their language, they have a responsibility too. And so, yeah, anything against the church can get that stir some pots for sure. And that's actually a pot I'm willing to go to. Why is that? Because that's a pot I want to stir more. And however, I want to also recognize that the terms that social justice terms that really are getting in the way. It's the words in our dialogue on social media. It's the words in our conversation around the table. What about the situation, right? We don't talk about religion and politics at the kitchen table. Like, this is how I raised my children.
I know. Yeah.
Like, what? That's all we talk about at the table. So,
And you know that, and that's like even my daughter trying to figure out like what is appropriate, but she is homeschooled. So
Uh,
when we talk about politics, when we talk about religion, we talk about indigenous issues in general, you know, it's at least not the curriculum she would get ever at the in the public school system that we
right.
have here. And for those who may not know, here in Alberta, we still fund with public dollars the Catholic school system too.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
oh yeah, Humanist Canada just put out a massive report. I guess they studied across Canada, and it was appalling. Just here in BC, I think it's $62 million goes to the Catholic school system. And, you know, public schools are suffering and need more funding. But let's look, this is appalling. They're still, you know, making prayer in our legislature as public. Yeah, this is a whole other conversation here.
Right. So, but
Mm,
it does relate in the sense that it
absolutely.
is very hard to unnormalize, you know, hate against Indigenous people, white supremacy, Christian supremacy, when we're literally sending our children to Catholic schools still, right? So,
The
like,
provincial.
it is part and parcel because a lot of, depending on what, you know, the spectrum of the Christian church you're in, it is perfectly okay for, you know, children to be hit. You know, so
Absolutely.
it's all part and parcel. And again, back to LGBTQ2
Yeah.
plus, like that very is depending on the spectrum. We have some affirming churches here,
Mm-hmm.
and and a few leaders in that world that I try to when I, you know, try to amplify maybe more of their messages to some of my Christian and Catholic followers because you know, 25% of Indigenous people are still Catholic because of going through the, you know, literally being
Assimilated.
traumatized and
Yeah.
assaulted by that system, and they're still there. And I say that because my own family identifies Catholic. My Indigenous family identifies Catholic. So for me to be reclaiming my culture, like, is way outside of their comfort level because of what happened at Indian Residential School and the ramifications of that. So, um, you know, it's really hard to try to navigate this, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, a lot of Indigenous actually think that I'm too white and such. But I'm like, well, this is just my experience. You don't have to like it. You don't have to listen. You don't have to share it. You don't have to retweet it. This is just my experience, and that's why I'm really careful to say in all my podcasts, I don't speak on behalf of all Indigenous because some were so lucky to be raised in their culture by healthy
Mm-hmm.
family, and hats off to them. You know, like that makes me proud. And even when I had learned about the gravity of what my family
Mm-hmm.
had gone through, like I am that representation of something that was tried to you know, not I'm not supposed to be here, and I'm certainly not supposed to be a proud Dene woman, you know, that not according to the history of Canada and all of the different government policies that were forced upon my family, all the diseases they lived through. You know, I have my daughter homeschooled during this COVID pandemic. We are disproportionately affected negatively by this pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
and yet, you know, I live in a place where it's like the Calgary Public Library would rather cut me off and my book club because their bigger funders are like, no, everything's back to normal. We're going to have in-person book clubs again. And it's like, you're
Mm-hmm.
not Indigenous book clubs. You go and give her. But if you're not willing to accommodate, then we're done. And I think this will be our last partnership because I'm just so,
So
you know, that
disappointing,
they're
right?
not doing the work of Call to
Yeah.
Action 57, which is public servants having to do anti-racism training and Indigenous
Right.
education. They are failing all across the board. Like I have yet to see um, even there's, you know, church groups trying to have committees, and I've yet to see them really break through their own white supremacy, their Christian supremacy. Like it's just not understood yet. So
Yeah.
maybe, and I do this work obviously in the hopes that the next generation will hopefully have it better, and that this generation feels empowered to learn who they are, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. And what came up for me was thinking, even going back to the beginning, in recognizing why we're here in Repeal Section 43, the conversation of the Roman Catholic Church and church groups is a big challenge, and also a huge opposition in the Supreme Court case in 2004, where the repeal was put on the table. And the only small shift was that teachers can no longer use violent discipline. they can use reasonable force for removal. The Canadian Teachers Federation is also an oppressor of children in the way that they would like this law to stay in place, this archaic colonial law. And we need to make this very clear. The Canadian Teachers Federation would like this law to stay in place. So we have to understand why that is. And the reason why, from my point of view, is that the Canadian Teachers Federation would be destitute because teachers are under stress. And when there's adults under stress, kids get hurt. So having a law that protects children over teacher rights and union rights would definitely have an effect on the union coffers, I would imagine, and it should. So Canadian teachers out there, get to your school boards, get to your unions, and make sure that maybe sign the joint statement at the CHIO that we've set up. You can contact us to find out more. And stand up against the Federation. I mean, unionized workplaces are great, but we also have to recognize that some of the unions have been around a really long time. And in that conversation, along with the 2004 court date, the Canadian Teachers Union had intervener status, along with a coalition for children. The Coalition for Children was a group of far right. Well, at the time, it wasn't so right. Actually, it was many religious organizations. The Real Women of Canada, and I believe that the leader of that, I'm not sure, just putting on the record, maybe so, was Stephen Harper's wife. So we have to really look at the history that we have here. When we look at Repeal Section 43, what we are actually looking at is unpacking archaic interpretations and harmful interpretations of Scripture. That's what brought violence to this land, and that's what needs to remove violence through this land. So we encourage people to recognize how Scripture is interpreted to continue white supremacy, to add violence, ageism, racism. This book here, and I'll just put this up here, Decolonizing Discipline, edited by Valerie Michelson and Dr. Joan Durant, is a really, you can see I've highlighted almost every interview I've had to bring it up, because it's become my scripture in how I understand this legislation that needs to be changed. So yeah, we do need to continue to stand up and make Canada more secular and also sacred to the land. We have a huge responsibility to do that, and that's why we're here today. So in repealing Section 43, Call to Action 6, most of the folks, thank goodness, that are on our team are white folks. And so I'm happy to say that. However, we've done a really, this is kind of a new public awareness campaign. What our goal is to involve more children, because children have a right to participate in things that affect them. So that's one thing. And also to recognize that this repeal of 43, there's been activists working on this for decades. And these advisors and researchers and scholars, then the Truth and Reconciliation Report came out in 2015, which really confirmed a lot of research and also created this opportunity for like this dialogue to happen like here today. So when you think about white responsibility, Michelle, I really want to hear from you, like white responsibility, because that's a term that's definitely, you put it out there and people get, what does it mean for you, right?
Yeah. I really do believe that, you either understand your privilege or you don't. And a lot of people don't, and they don't want to understand it. So for folks who do, I only work with them, obviously. And you're one of those people that are understanding of what that is. So for folks who are like, okay, well, define it from your point of view, Michelle. At the end of the day, because in order to live in Canada, we had to have the Indian Act. And they put us on these tiny reserves. So they literally stole the land, literally. The Northwest Mounted Police made sure we were kept there. The Indian agent made sure we were kept there. We were not allowed to leave our land. So that's its own violence. This is like the start of the violence against Indigenous people. But what did this really do? It broke treaty. Now, when we make treaty as Indigenous people, we do that. It's a sacred covenant. Because we assume when we're in ceremony and we share our pipe with people who are like-minded and want to live together equally, that they understood what that meant. At no point in time have we lived equally now. In the opposite, our land has been exploited, our bodies have been exploited, we have been killed, we're on ongoing genocide as a result of all of this exploitation. all of it. So for white people to say I worked hard for what I got, they do need to realize that that was at the expense of Indigenous people, our lands, equal profit sharing, everything.
Mhm.
It's always at our expense. And
Mhm.
for those who identify as Black, there was a lot of slavery.
Mhm.
So for folks to say we worked hard for what we got, well, explain that a bit. Like how did that happen? Because if you really look deep, you had exploited labor, and to this day we have exploited labor
Oh
with the
yeah,
foreign
yeah,
workers program that we have here in Alberta.
right.
I know
The migrant workers
activists
and the
who
farms.
speak about migrant workers being
Mhm.
unable to get a simple vaccine for the COVID-19. Incredible conditions that nobody is going to survive well at, especially in a
Yeah,
pandemic. Like just absolutely no rights, no health rights, no human rights, and that is today in Alberta, in
yeah,
all of these farm labors, all of these a lot of the Tim Hortons, all of these places have these foreign temporary workers who have zero rights. So,
absolutely.
like for anyone to say, I work hard for what I got, it's like, did you? So,
Yeah, yeah,
so we
that's
got to
really
start there,
important. Yeah,
really. We got to
and
start there with white responsibility.
there's the term there. Another one is white privilege that I hear about. I worked hard for what I got, and I think what you said is so important. We need to actually look at how you got there, and the steps that you did not need to take to get there. The oppression that did not face was been put in your face to get there, right? So I've heard that over and over again in working in communities that Indigenous women, Black women have to you know over present, over perform themselves to
Yeah.
actually be welcome in rooms. And the thought of that, so yeah, and it's funny you hear that term from mostly middle-aged white men. I worked really hard for what I got. And you look at what they got a beer belly and no action. So, it's not something to be super proud of that you stepped on people to sit on your couch all day. So
Yeah.
it's sorry, I'm at the point now where it's important we have honest conversations, and I welcome the same thing back at me. That's why I'm here.
Hmm.
Um, it's really, really important. So privilege, white responsibility. When it comes to the calls to action, what are some of can you give some advice? Because honestly, I find that part really hard. Like here I am out there, I put my face out there, but I'm not sure how to engage in a way that is gonna, like what else can we do?
Yeah, I think it's really important that people understand amplifying Indigenous voices. So, yeah, we have a report from 2015 that you and I are using and using that number six in order to talk about it. But like
Mhm.
in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples came out, that report came out.
Yeah.
And they were being talked about then. Our ancestors have never not told the solutions. It has been absolutely laid out for
Mhm.
non-indigenous people. They just need to listen, and that is actually the barrier. So there's a small video that I show when I do teachings about anti-indigenous bias, because at the end of the day, a lot of folks won't listen to indigenous voices. They will only listen to yours because of their deep-seated anti-indigenous bias, and it
Mm.
comes from how you and I were raised. When you look at these social, like I'm homeschooling my daughter, and part of the reason why is you can open up any social studies book from any point in the grade system in
It's like with
anywhere in Canada.
McDonald and
Yeah, it is problematic, 100% racist. And
100%.
I believe to this day in our public school systems, we are teaching white supremacy to the children because we refuse to do this work of anti-racism work.
Mm.
So from my point of view, every person has to look at themselves and go, what am I doing for anti-racism work? Every single one. So that's the number one thing. And if we're not working on anti-racism work, you're not helping Indigenous people. Two, amplify our voices. It is so easy for all in non-Indigenous people across this country to highlight the Truth and Reconciliation Commission
Mhm.
reports, the missing and murdered Indigenous women reports.
Mhm.
Like those were written by Indigenous with Indigenous voices. Honor that. Honor them. I always say honor the treaties. Treaties meant equality. So I'll walk into most places and absolutely not allowed to smudge. Why is that?
Mm-hmm.
I remember, you and I know, we grew up in a time where you could have every single office worker had a smoke in their hand and an ashtray. Every single one. All of these buildings were designed for all of the smokers to be able to smoke. So don't deny me access to my smudge. And especially if you're trying to bring in an Indigenous person.
Mm.
We have lots of spirituality rooms where you can pray and do all sorts of things. So, like these are simple things of issues of equality that are not present anywhere. Um, Land acknowledgments, I think, are critical. If you can't name to me the land that you're on off the top of your head, you're no ally. If you have to read a script,
Mm-hmm.
you're no ally. Now, I understand reading a script at first, but after some time, you should be able to say it
Yeah.
out the script.
And
you
I'm
know?
laughing, but because I think too, what came up when you said that, and I don't want to really pause you because I'm starting a list now of really important points, but I think it's important what you said. Land acknowledgements are super important. It's important to start with the script. And those people that aren't on meetings a lot, you know, you're going to get caught into a meeting. So it's time to open up, nativeland.ca and find out about the land you're on soon. So this should be, so get your script, got ready, understand and study the land you're on. So I just want to make sure that we talk about that. Keep going. I'm hearing a great list.
Yeah, no, and that does have to be understood because if we're going to start creating equality, like you
Mm-hmm.
should know your treaty that you're on. If you don't, you should know where the treaty boundaries are,
Mm-hmm.
the nation boundaries. Like Canadians think of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, but we need to start thinking about the nations, right?
Right.
Like we're
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
this territory, we're in this territory,
Yeah.
we're in this territory, and seeing that our overlap is a non-colonial
Mm-hmm.
construct, right? The United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, that's my Bible. That is
Right.
100% my Bible because it, again, we're
Is this a
talking about,
book?
yeah, this is free. This is a PDF that's free for everybody. And this was
Oh,
made,
the ungrip, the actual
yeah.
ungrip. Oh, I didn't know that you could actually get it ordered like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And
Oh,
they
I'm
have,
gonna get
it's at
that.
the end of the TRC books as well for most
Okay, yeah,
summaries.
yeah. I've got
Um,
the TRC books here. Well, the Truth and Reconciliation report. Anyway, I've got that one. A friend of mine printed that out as a gift. But
No, well,
definitely
I have like all the volumes. Like I bring the volumes with me.
good for.
And
This is great.
in my book club we unpack the volumes, not just the summary of it. Because
Right.
there's not context. In fact, one of the things I hate the most right now at this exact moment is opening up my social media or the news and seeing anybody who isn't Indigenous have a single opinion on the Pope. I don't give a flying about your opinion because if you had read the TRC, you know it's about Indigenous who survived these stupid Catholic schools and their opinion. So even myself, I just honor what they said. If an Indian residential school survivor hears the Pope and feels better, that's all that matters to me. And in
Hmm.
fact, even our generation, the ones who haven't been forced to go to Indian residential schools,
Mm-hmm.
even their opinion pisses me off a lot because
Mm-hmm.
it's not about them. It's about my granny who was forced to go to Sacred Heart in Fort Providence and
Mm-hmm.
watch all of her students die and be put in shitty, shallow graves. Oh, apologies for using that terminology. Um, this is her journey while she's still
Yeah.
here. This isn't about me. I hate the Catholic Church. I could go burn down the Vatican right now. I wouldn't care. But it's not about me. It's about her. It's about
Mm-hmm.
that. So for
Mm-hmm.
folks who are non-indigenous or even my generation, so just to give people perspective, you are looking at somebody who graduated high school in 94. Those graves that came out of Cowessness First Nation, that
Mm-hmm.
residential school closed in 97. So we're
Okay.
talking Spice Girl era. You
Yeah.
know, like give it. You always see black and white pictures of Indian residential schools, but
I
if you
know,
did,
right?
but they were that recent, right?
Well,
Let alone the effects that have come from multi generations attending these stupid schools. I
it's
It's
incredible.
really important to me talking about the Pope. that the only voices that matter are the chief little child,
Mm,
Mary Sinclair, those who like literally attended these stupid schools. That's their opinion matters, not mine. And so, you know, I really do wish that non-Indigenous would learn their place to sometimes be silent or amplify the voice of someone else. And trying to find the one native that, fits your conservative narrative, that's not helping anyone. That's just weaponizing Indigenous against Indigenous, and that's unfair. And to me, you have to look at the most oppressed demographic. So, a person with disability, one who's two spirit, they're dealing with racism, they're dealing with gendered violence, and they're dealing with ableism in this ridiculous construct of Canada now. So
mhm.
these are the voices that I try to amplify, right? And the youth. The youth are experiencing their ways
The
after multi
change. Yeah.
generations of a system that's been set up to fail.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
What
kind of where I would start.
uh,
Amplifying Indigenous voices.
talk, I guess, to talk. I think there's enough supporting research and documents, and more importantly, storytellers that are ready to talk about the truth. And I really appreciate you mentioning today and also on our podcast. And it's really been resonating with me that the solutions have been written. We just need to listen. And listening isn't my great strength. I'm more of an extrovert. So I'm really kind of feeling this, I need to listen more. Like, where can I put my ears on the ground? Where, I need to listen more. So thank you for reminding of that. So we need to listen. The solutions are there. And
Yeah, so and we're in a multimedia generation now. So if
right.
you prefer to listen via radio, podcast, if you prefer reading, if you prefer art, it's all there. Like it's not
So
from a lack
important.
of it. It's just from that deep anti-Indigenous bias that makes people blind to seeing Indigenous voices, Indigenous art, Indigenous everything. We even have
Everything.
Indigenous reporters now, right?
Yeah.
There's not a lack of information. So,
Oh,
and these reports are all free.
they're all free, and literally it's once you start looking for information. If you could see what I'm sitting in right now, it's like piles of books, reports, papers, and really just trying to get through to understanding the story, understanding the truth, but also seeing how my family lineage breaks into that. My daughter's doing a great job unpacking, our Mayflower story and all the, and really just saying, hey, like we need to listen, but when we listen, we need to listen for these key words and embrace them as power words. Like, so it's not, I see people feeling like it's a knife. Like, yeah, I'm going to actually call you racist. I am. And I'm sorry, but I'm racist too sometimes. So we need to actually get through that term. And when you call people out on their white supremacy or aligning with white supremacists, right? And you say, hey, that's racist. Are you a racist? To me, that's a fair question.
Mm,
So I think it's important that we get comfortable with the language, but first, in order to understand the language, you need to learn and listen.
hmm.
And
Yeah.
also like what you said. I think that the biggest piece is actually being anti-racist. So it's not just being, I am not a racist. I'm interested in people that are anti-racist, asking the hard questions, who are, you know, active in deconstructing, the whole ideologies around in our society that have been here for 100 years or more. It's about deconstruction, and that is a force. So peace is not passive. It's time to really stand up, and anti-racism is about those that are willing to speak up and stand up. I love that you said about amplifying voices. So I heard a little thread there. I want to touch a little bit more on this. So folks that are oppressed, right? Indigenous people, Indigenous women, are less likely to be in the rooms of decision makers and policymakers and those that are, making the decisions and writing the regulations and the bylaws in our communities and in our province, and of course at a federal level as well. So the inequality of decision making is part of the systemic barrier that is in the way for change. So it's important. The reason why I meant a lot to do this talk today is I recognize my role, and just even a staff meeting or even in talking to my family, but in my studies and in conversations and dialogue and forums of debate. that it's up to me to amplify these voices because I'm in the room. I'm in the room because I grew up white and it was easier for me to be here. It wasn't, I could say, oh, it wasn't as easy for me particularly, but what the heck, I had more opportunity and I was not facing and am not facing genocide of my white cis gingery self. So I know that it's my responsibility to get in the room. And when I'm in the room, my ears need to be on the table for those key phrases. And if those key phrases aren't being talked about, I need to put them there. So when we talk about getting in the rooms, Michelle, that to me is the work of white people. All of
Yep,
this
I would
that
also
is
say you encapsulated that really well. But here is the thing that really I wish white people would see. Folks like me are trying to get at that table, and I'm not underqualified compared to a Jason Kenney to be there. So
right.
why aren't I there? So it's, when we are there, it is important to pay us. It's important to make sure that we're not, our voices are valued. You would pay a
Yeah.
PhD or a PhD. You would pay Romeo Sinclair to come and speak. Why don't we pay Indigenous people? We're at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder because we were purposely excluded. And in this world now, we're not being included financially in any capacity. So it's really important that we get at these tables and we're paid to be there. Obviously, our protocols ask that we are given tobacco for our knowledge as well. And there are some things we know we can't share. There's lots of things I won't share, especially in a forum like this, because it's not my place to. And we have so much exploitation of even our knowledge, that are when we do share, it's misused. And today somebody was sharing Maslow's hierarchy, and that's a great example of something that was stolen straight from the Blackfoot Nation.
Yeah.
And never given proper accreditation, certainly, in the psychologist world.
So
and ironically, here in
yeah.
Alberta, where the Blackfoot territory is predominant, we still don't have culturally appropriate supports for dealing with all of the trauma that was inflicted by colonization. So it is so ridiculous. Now, that said, we have some great programs, and I'm not going to undermine or undervalue them, but for the most part, Christian organizations, white-led organizations are given funding, not our people, not our boards, right? It's a cycle to cycle, which is why our organizations will fail as opposed to something like a YMCA or
right.
like literally Christian is in its name, CCIS, Catholic is in its name.
Yeah.
Right? They're given regular budgeting as opposed to our people. So, these are really important things that, it is time. When my daughter, we have an Indigenous youth program here, and they feed them. They pay for them to get there, their transportation, whether it's through bus tickets or whichever, and then they give them food, like good food, like Olive Garden, whatever it is that
Yeah.
they budgeted for. Because that's not something that I can take her to Olive Garden very frequently with the socioeconomic status I have. These are things that are important to say because we still don't identify as Indigenous if we can avoid it, because we know the moment we do, we are discriminated against. And because Canadians have such a narrow view of what Native has to look like, which can be to our detriment at times. Like it's just racism. It's so much racism right there in that one statement. If we can go and not identify, we won't, because of how racist the society still is, and that's not okay. We should all be proud of who we are, and we can't be. Otherwise, we have teachers hit us. And I wanted to also say, because you had made a point earlier that the teachers are fighting this as well, and I want to make it very clear that able-bodied teachers don't know how to deal with kids with disabilities, and the kids with disabilities are disproportionately being abused. And I think it's really important for us as able-bodied people that we work really hard to include that. And in fact, I know adults with that identify with autism that are are speaking out so loudly about the violence that they received as
Mhm.
children, that are still common practices that teachers
Mhm.
like to use, and how harmful it is. And I say that because as Indigenous people, we are disproportionately affected by healthcare and racist healthcare. So our people are just so underserved in so many
So
ways.
much.
Yep.
You're bringing up such an important point. A couple of weeks ago, I was lucky to attend a journal club about a new publication, research paper that came out that was looking at seclusion and suspension in U.S. schools, and they were measuring, which students were more likely to be suspended and excluded, and measuring their ACEs, so their average childhood experiences. And the conversation was an incredible conversation, a great dialogue with. A bunch of folks, kind of professionals, really talking about, hey, what's going on here? The surprising news from that paper, and I don't have the author with me or even the paper right now, and I wish I did, was that the most likely to be suspended or expelled from a school in the United States by age 9 was Black girls.
Hmm.
And appalling to think about what sort of ACEs or adverse childhood experience a Black young girl under 5 might be experiencing. And they showed that, the types of abuse that were more likely, kind of thing. And it was just sickening to think. So here in Canada, there is the BC Ed Access. I mean, in BC, some advocacy groups that are really working to help bring better dialogue and also help teachers have more options, as well as there's empowering EA programs too, so educational assistance. I'm somebody who has scars all over my arms because I began my career working in the front lines of elementary schools, and particularly with children that were on the spectrum of autism. So I recognize the need for that. And at the time, you're right, Michelle, like at the time, ABA holds, this was kind of commonplace. And I'm looking back, the least effective of all the work I ever did. The most effective was taking the children to an open space, giving them a microphone, and, telling them they could play with the lights, or, really getting into their STEM, like really good, getting into it. That was the most kind of exciting work, but that's not really within the structure of the school environment. So there was a lot of difficulty that because it's just we don't create environments for all kids. So children with disabilities definitely are at the forefront of this work. Thank you for mentioning that, because people need to recognize our school system is so part of colonization. It's not just because of, like you said, the stupid residential schools, because I think that's a great phrase, the stupid schools. It's not just that. Our kids are, even white kids, are being indoctrinated today. How they sit in lines. I mean, the pedagogy of teaching is incredible. The panoptic sense of colonization, we are watching you, be scared of us, is so part of our system still. So in order to
Well, and
break
we have
that,
quite the spotlight on that here in Alberta, because like the biggest fight we're having is over curriculum, and you have the ultra conservatives who never want to mention anything about Indigenous people, but also want to amplify ridiculous points about John A. Macdonald or whichever. So it like right now that fight is happening, so for everyone to see. But again, it's one of those biases, you either see it or you don't. And for folks who have anti-Indigenous bias, they don't necessarily see that, and worse, vote these folks in. Although that wasn't the F word I would have preferred to use.
and I think that's it, right? Like, so it's about digging in, because when you dig in, for some reason, it is not for some reason, for the reality. That's the reason. By fact, by science, by fact, by reality, it's deep. It goes deep. You need to dig in and dive in. You end up your whole body piled into it. I get texts from my daughter, who's also studying, she's studying land ecology and physics and all sorts of things, but she's becoming quite passionate on human effect on the land. And so Indigenous peoples of BC, she's mapped it all out and all kinds of things, right? Like, this is her passion. I get texts from her, quotes of John MacDonald, right? Things like this, where you're just like, wow, like, because mom, like, this is what kids are being taught.
And
Yeah.
worse, in buildings called John A. Macdonald School all across the country.
All across the country, right? And just blind. So there's this unconscious bias, this blindness and willful ignorance. I will say willful now, because the information that's out there for us to learn about it is there. So if you're ignorant of this, there's a will there somewhere. So there is a huge responsibility to take a deep breath and just, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciated this conversation. I hope that we touched on all of the points you wanted to touch on.
thank you so much, Michelle, for
Yeah.
being here. And I think these conversations, they're going to continue. And I appreciate your honesty and your story and your courage, and also just your spirit of reconciliation is felt all the way to here. And yeah, allyship all in, however that looks, whatever the learning looks. No Violence for Kids Canada is definitely working towards understanding more of that. Anybody who's watching out there, I noticed that we did have a few live watchers. Please feel free to star, like, share any of our posts on No Violence for Kids Canada. I also do want to let everybody know to go to nativecalgarian.ca.
Calm. Calm.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and make sure you check out Michelle's podcast, Natal. It is incredible. It is an archive of information. So if you're looking to learn and you're doing some business or whatever, put your headphones on and press play. It is an incredible resource and really, really knowledgeable all the way from like the federal level to in your home level. So it does really, you do such a beautiful job, Michelle, on your podcast of bringing it home, but also bringing the responsibility. So I encourage everybody, go to nativecalgarian.ca and visit Michelle's podcast, like, share, and tweet and yell out from the rooftops how awesome it is. And thank you to everybody who is watching. We're No Violence for Kids Canada, and our work is in raising awareness for call to action 6, and that's to repeal Section 43 of our criminal code. There's no excuse for child abuse, and we need all of us to stand up and make sure that we end corporal punishment in Canada as soon as possible. Thanks for being here, everybody.